Welcome. Thank you for joining us for the 5th session of Evolution of the Arts in a Digital World Symposium. I'm Alison Kenny-Gartos, Vice President of Music and Engagement at the Francis Winspear Center for Music, Edmonton Symphony Orchestra. It's lovely to see that we've got so many participants online, and looking at our poll, it seems that we have a strong representation today from our music industry friends. So welcome. And first time, I think we've got science and technology joining us as well. I'd like to give a shout out to the Canada Council of the Arts for their Digital Strategy Fund. And this is funding that's made it possible for us to be able to offer these sessions to participants at no charge. But we would ask that you consider making a donation. These days, like all of the organizations, we depend on community now more than ever. There's a link in your chat for that donation. All right, now for our fireside chat. We did want to have some fire images burning in the background, but that didn't work out. So you have to imagine that we're all gathered around a fire for this. And we're gathering to talk about institutional change, funding, and infrastructure. Our symposium is proving without a doubt that there are a variety of factors to consider when making the jump to digital technology. So today we're sitting down with some high level discussion about factors relating to that transition, about funding experiences we can't necessarily monetize, about the digital impact on art forms, and so much more. I'm delighted to welcome 7 panelists today: Anne-Marie Petrov, Tateo Nakajima, Annette Mies, Rafael Baldwin, Gretchen Koss, Scott Smallwood, and Milan Krapelka. As I introduce each speaker, you will see a short biography for them in the chat, but you can read their full biography in the attendee package. And a link to the attendee package has just been sent in the chat. Or it is about to be sent. Our speakers will be pondering 7 questions today. Each speaker will have about 4 minutes to respond to the question we pose to them. We will be opening the floor to question and answer near the end of the presentation. So as you think of questions, please go ahead and pop them into the chat. All right, we are ready to move on. And I'd like to pose our first question to Gretchen Koss, Senior Vice President of Strategic Partnerships at Gallagher and Associates. And we met Gretchen a few weeks ago for her wonderful session. So Gretchen, let's take a moment to consider the cultural change involved in making the transition to digital. What important aspects do we need to be thinking of? Over to you, Gretchen.
Great, thank you so much. And I'm glad to be able to kick off this session. I'm going to touch on a couple of things that are more on a high level perspective, as opposed to getting into some of the detail that we'll get into later. I would say one of the first things to consider in the transition or in beginning to introduce technology and digital media into your institution is, do you have the staff to maintain and curate content? We talked a little bit in the session that I did about the idea of set it and forget it. This is one point that is directly related to that, and the idea that technology has a really wonderful ability to be flexible, but that also creates a challenge for you in being able to maintain and curate that content to stay fresh and relevant. In relation to that, it's really important to think about having an ongoing line item in your budget for technology. That can mean that you have consultants that have content that they'll be creating for you. That can mean that you have hardware that should be replaced or maintained. That can mean that you're adding or augmenting. But the idea of getting used to having a line item that isn't just as you put it in initially, but that can be maintained over time. I'd like to have you think about one of the things in this sort of culture change that talks about the fact that does the level of technology align with your personality and your mission as an institution, or have you imported a media element that is just something you liked from somewhere you saw? I cannot tell you how many times we have clients ask us if we've seen a media piece in a different environment and can we export that into their particular institution. In some cases, elements of that are possible, but you need to be thinking about, is it appropriate for you? Another couple of points that I'll go into. I think that we think about technology so many times about a site, the idea of an element that creates visuals. If you can think about stimulating all of the senses with technology and media, that means sight, sound, touch, smell. If there are some trigger points that mean that your experience can be expanded by looking at those other senses, it's a really wonderful, wonderful tool to use for that. How does tech address your audience needs and engagement? This is one that gets back to strategizing and looking at your messaging and your audience and looking at different layers of engaging that audience. So depending on the level of knowledge that they have or interest, your technology should really look at how you engage each of those audience groups. And I would say last but not least, virtual platforms are quite often looked at in a siloed type of strategy. What I want to ask you to do is to look at the fact that your branding and your messages must sync between your physical experience and messaging and that extension into the virtual and the digital realm. So, Alison, I think those are the points I think we can unwrap a little bit into the future.
Thank you, Gretchen. I'm actually going to direct the same question over to Scott Smallwood. Scott is the sound artist and director of the University of Alberta Sound Studies Institute. And so, Scott, just to refresh, we are asking you to consider the cultural change involved in making the transition to digital. What important aspects do we need to be thinking about?
Great. Thank you for the question, and thanks for inviting me today. This has already been really interesting. Yeah, I mean, this is a big question. One thing I want to just remind everyone of is that, well, first of all, the digital transition in the world has already happened. It happened a long time ago, right? And so I think what we're looking at here today is, I think, not so much a transition. I mean, that may be the case for particular presenting organizations, of course, but I think it's actually more of a call to diversify what gets trumpeted in our society as high art, right? I think, now I'm not going to claim that the orchestra is dead. I'll receive a lot of negative feedback if I say that. And I don't think it's dead. I think the orchestra is alive and well, but I think it needs to make room for other modes of live performance that reflect the contemporary musical landscape. In some cases, and I know the Winspear has done that quite a bit already, and I think that's really positive. But just a reminder that the digital transition or the integration of the digital into the fine and performing arts that has already happened has resulted in new modes of presenting, new languages, new ways of presenting work. It's also, and this is really important, it's also enabled the entire world, connected world, through the increased connectivity of the mediascape, of the internet, essentially, to learn more about other cultures of music making, whether that's digital or not, and how that has been integrated into contemporary composers and sound artists' work already, right? Case in point, when I was in college, so I'll just admit I'm in my 50s, I'm in my early 50s. And so the internet was not around when I was doing my undergraduate training in music. And so for me at that time, this was, late 80s, early 90s, it was still really difficult to find recordings of, I don't know, say contemporary gamelan music or in Inuit hip hop or any kind of non-Western, non-digital musics from other cultures, with some exceptions. So it was hard to find. Now we are inundated with it. There is no excuse, right, for any of us to not know about the many rich and wonderful traditions of music all over the world, digital or not, right? So I think that the digital revolution has created a situation where we have an expanded view of what's possible, right? And it demands that we double down or even triple down on EDI issues, equity, diversity, and inclusion. This includes not only work that, seeking out composers and performers who come from minority backgrounds, but also the actual cultural knowledge that other forms of music articulate. So when we, and I think there's been a lot of positive change in the last 10 or 15 years around being more open-minded about other forms of music. So I think all that's really important. Flexibility, by the way, 4 minutes is is so hard. So please ping me if I'm going over here. But I think flexibility is really important as well in terms of what can be presented and how it can be presented. Understanding that understanding that this notion of high and low art, which we've inherited from essentially colonialism, is something we really need to trouble when we think about these things. I grew up in a time, for example, when it was still normal to talk about classical music as high art, and everything else fell into various subcategories of popular music or world music or jazz or whatever. And those are extremely damaging ways of thinking about music today. There are so many forms of popular music that are unpopular, right? That are doing experimental things. So anyway, I think I see the hand, and I'll stop there, but that's just a little smattering of thoughts.
And Scott, I know there are some questions that are following that relate quite directly to what you've been talking about. I know that the other speakers will be really excited to pick up on that. And also some questions at question and answer time. You've raised some really, really interesting and provocative thoughts. So thank you for that. And I will also mention that Scott is going to be one of our speakers. It's coming up next week. So there's more coming from Scott. So our next question is for Annette Mies, and Annette is the head of the Audience Labs at the Royal Opera House. Annette, in your opinion, what is the biggest challenge in making the transition to digital?
Well, there are many, and some of which have been set up really beautifully by both Gretchen and Scott, I think. I think for me, one of the things to start with is that it can feel a bit overwhelming because so many things are possible. As Gretchen says, it's really important that you find your own identity in that and find a way that this serves what you are as an organization, your artistic mission, your civic mission, but how to do that. I think one of the things to really take into account from the start is that there is the short term and the long term. And then there is the road in the middle. I think what I often see in organizations that they go very short term. Let's do something. We have seen this thing over here. Let's do something like that over here as well. And actually in that lose the sense of the journey they're on as an organization and as an organization who creates work. And we all work in, or most of us work in performing arts, which, it's about liveness. It's an ever evolving art form. It's different every night. So how does that translate into strategically what you want to do with digital? I think, we're in a very particular time right now. It's very crisisful. So there's a lot of let's go to digital to make money and save ourselves from complete eradication. And I think that is quite a complex place to start innovating from. I was reminded yesterday by a friend of the brilliant quote of the late great Chadwick Boseman as King Chala: "In times of crisis, the wise build bridges and the fools build walls." And I think that's very much, for me, a very important point right now is digital should be a way to build bridges with your audiences, new audiences, with artists, with other artistic organizations. Scott really beautifully talked about it's a real way of opening up the art form and the way art is produced and who gets to produce it to more diverse audiences, more diverse makers, and really think about how to enrich and enliven the identity and the mission that we have as cultural organizations, part of, civic life. It is, next to that, super important, as Gretchen pointed towards, that you find your own identity. We're not all the Met, we're not all the Royal Opera House, we don't have to be. And there is something that in the past, that identity partly was created by geography, right? We're over here, and the people that can come here are the people that can take a train or take the car, and it's a reasonable place. The digital sphere, geography is less of an issue. So what is the thing that replaces it? What makes you unique in the world? What's the identity? And what is it that you want to say and explore? And then you come, obviously, to the money. How do you explore? So what are the partnerships that are possible, both financially, but also artistically, with other organizations? Can you devise new way of working, new artistic methodologies, new ways of exploring your identity on these new digital spaces? I think those, for me, are like the important questions to start with. So rather than what thing do we put on what platform, it's who do we want to be in this space, with whom do we want to be in this space, and for who, and who do we want to connect to, both artistically, educationally, in all those different dimensions. So I think, and those are quite long-term thoughts, and then it becomes about, so how do you create short-term experiments and short-term spaces in which you can go on that journey, and again, keep it evolving and keep it alive, and think about new ways of opening up without losing who you are, and actually becoming more and more who you are within those spaces.
Thank you, Annette. Very wise words there. And to Teo, you're going to follow up on that question. And I suspect that Teo will certainly be in agreement with much of what Annette has said. So Teo, in your opinion, what's the biggest challenge in making the transition to digital?
I think it's a really good question. And you're right. I think different things that Scott, Gretchen, and Annette have said certainly resonate with what I've been thinking about that question. I think it's possibly useful to reflect on the fact that probably the biggest challenge for technology compared to other things that have changed our world up until now is just sheer speed. So if you think about the change from horse-drawn buggy to cars, for example, which have changed our lives immeasurably and in not necessarily good ways, as not always good ways, as we all know, societal change followed suit, but it was slower. And it was painful at the time, and entire cities have changed because of the way those industries have changed. And in a way, this technology is changing our societies, how we actually develop. So as people who are working in the cultural sphere, how we do things, who we do it for, how do we communicate, obviously is changing, and it's changing at that speed. In my work, it's often interesting, I think, to actually split the question of digital into a number of different categories. And certainly there's a whole aspect of efficiency. How can things be faster, smarter, more responsive, more informed by data? There is the question of how can we reach new audiences and more audiences, which is an interesting area that certainly a lot of the digital activity falls into. And then, of course, the fundamental transformation of some of the experiences that we're offering, the tools that artists have to communicate in different ways. Because at the end of the day, I think that's That's what it comes down to, is that these are just more tools and more variations in how we communicate from human beings to human beings. And the fact that people are more comfortable or expect or have um, a facility with technology is just another form of a technological evolution of which we are inheritors of multiple throughout time. I'd say at the end of the day, one of the interesting challenges we're seeing is that the speed and the realities of the competitive landscape is also changing. So as Annette mentioned, you may have completely new competitors, you may have completely new funders, you may have therefore opportunities, and therefore getting online itself, of course, was an immensely important way of connecting with audiences when we're all stuck in our living rooms. But actually now your competitors are legion. You don't have that geographical attachment. So how do you create that allegiance, and how do you do that is, I think, one of the big challenges. So to all of these things is speed, I think, and especially the impact it can have on our institutions, on how the whole funding ecosystem is set up. All of that, I think, is probably the biggest challenge, because we often find ourselves in a place where we are constrained to work within a system that no longer actually is fit for purpose, and the speed at which those things change is even slower than the way we can change. And the making sure that all of that works for us, and we are affecting change both around us as well as in what we're doing ourselves, is probably the biggest challenge. Oh, you're muted.
I'm seeing that we have a question for you from Eric Tateo. What is the impact of digital transition on arts forms? What happens to the traditional end product? You might want to speak to that just briefly, and I think that is a question that can come back later.
Oh, I think there will be many on this panel who would want to speak to that. Look, I think if we take it back to the fundamental, we are people who want to communicate, who want to speak to issues, to feelings, to communicate, to share, to cause dialogue, make people think, make people feel through different media: word, action, movement, sound, right? And the question becomes, how do you do that? So if everything was in black and white and pencil, then it's one thing, and you give a box of crayons, it suddenly becomes something else. I think digital should be seen in the same light fundamentally. It changes the canvas size, it changes the nature of the canvas. It is not, it used to be, it started from a way to document, and it became a tool. That happened many years ago. Stokowski was playing with that already, right? The whole question of the opportunity of digital as a medium is something that is nothing really new. And I think there are creatives out there, as Scott says, who for who this is their playground. I think the other thing to think about is that on the reception end, so one of my colleagues and the team in New York were co-producers of the world's first and still largest, I think, VR opera experience, where we had 6,000 people in Prospect Park with VR, listening to a live opera performance for the last 10 minutes of which was on VR headset. And that was interesting because it was a collective experience, because some of these technologies are somewhat isolating, which is antithetical to some of the point of some of our offer. So I think there's a lot of experimentation going on, and I think this is something that will only accelerate.
Thanks, Tateo. And actually, I'm going to ask Anne-Marie Spitzer, who's helping out today, just to keep that question for later, because I do think other people on the panel will be just chomping at the bit to respond. I'm going to move on now to our next question, which is for Rafael Baldwin. And Rafael was here last week giving an amazing presentation. Rafael is the digital media storyteller with the New World Symphony. So Rafael, what are some of the long-term results of our quick digital transition? And what are the skills we should be looking to develop as we move forward?
Well, first off, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I think that's a great couple of questions. In terms of the long-term benefits, first off, that many organizations, regardless of the industry, are finally incorporating at an institution-wide level tools such as Zoom for video conferencing and Microsoft 360 for sharing documents online, Slack, Trello, Monday, Asana for increasing productivity. No? Tools that we already had with us, but perhaps hadn't been fully adopted. And I think, those tools make things just more efficient. Another thing, the possibility of working remotely, now incorporating hybrid approaches such as working half of the week from home and half of the week at the office, or working remotely the 3 or 4 days around the holidays so that people could spend more time with their families. No, if companies give their employees some of their time back, I think that could even be more popular than sometimes a salary increase. Now, time is also a currency. In terms of the things in terms of the skills that I think we should keep looking to develop in the future, and that I think are as important to find in future employees as it is to ensure that current ones also have them. Number one, a true passion for acquiring new knowledge, a mindset that embraces studying, researching, and being eager to develop new skills. By having the right mindset, you'll be able to become completely fluent and competent with things that maybe have not been invented yet. No, and I think companies need to invest in their employees' continued education, and they need to do it every year. Number two, user experience research and design, and Tateo mentioned a little bit of this. No, this is a realm that has everything to do with your audience. So understanding what they do, what they like, how they live their lives, how they engage with your product. If you're trying to find ways to have people supporting your cause and giving you their money and time and attention, I think then you better care about them. Now, be interested in what they want, like, need, and means value to them. User experience research and design will help you tailor your products to them. Computer programming, I think it's important. No, right now we're having a conversation, but what I'm actually doing is talking to the camera, which is converting sound and light into data, which is being sent to the computer and sent to Zoom, which is sending it to the internet until it reaches your computers. So that's your Zoom can then present that, convert that data into audiovisual means through your monitor and speakers. So before I can actually talk to you, I'm interacting with a bunch of machines and software components. So learning how to talk to a machine is important, and that's what computer programming is all about. No, I also think that data analytics and data visualization are important. No, how to make sense of a large data set and then put it in the right perspective. No, how to gather that information and analyze some statistics and find some patterns and trends and identify opportunity areas and analyze the evolution of what we're doing through an entire month, year, campaign, season, etc. It allows us to dive into a bunch of unintelligible data and recognize important findings to inform and optimize what we do. And then I think one last thing, storytelling. Now, the principles and best practices on how to structure a clear, efficient, and compelling message to maximize its potential. No? I think you're mute, Alison.
Someday I'll learn. I'm going to thank you, Rafael. I'm going to pose the same question now to Milan Kropelka. And Milan is the Senior Manager of Exhibit Design and Quality at the TELUS World of Science in Edmonton. So Milan, I'm posing the same question, and I know that your spin, of course, will probably reflect similar and differently from Rafael's. So Milan, what are some of the long-term results of our quick digital transition, and what are the skills we should be looking to develop as we move forward?
Thank you. It's really great to hear the panelists here today. I'm really feeling enriched already from just a few answers that they've provided for us. So thank you for that. There's been some observations here on how we've all been forced by Rafael to make transition to digital connectivity in our current climate. And we feel that here at Telescope of Science, our primary role really has been in the past to create exhibits and show, demonstrations of science experiments and to run movies in our theaters, all of which require people to come and gather, none of which we can do at this point in any real capacity. So we have been forced to make the transition to being online a little bit. But we do hope that we'll return to having people come to our doors one day and really experience our exhibits and be back with us in person. And so I'll speak about that day as opposed to the day we're in right now, which is hopefully a temporary thing for a year or two. We at Telescope of Science, we call ourselves an informal science education facility. And so we don't focus on performance art as many of the speakers and guests here today do in that same traditional sense. We strive to have connections to curriculum for Alberta's education system so teachers can bring their students here for field trips and learn in that way. But we do it in a way that keeps emphasis on experiences that they can't have typically in the classroom or in their own homes. So my role in that process is to work with a team of scientists, educators, to accomplish that with delivery exhibit experiences. And I like what Gretchen said earlier, talking about engaging all the senses. I think that's key to having a meaningful emotional impact, a transformative impact, if you will. So when I think of my own work, I try to think less about making exhibits and more about creating experiences for people, to come and experience objects. Certainly I design objects, but hopefully through the use of objects that they have an experience that helps them transform from one state of belief to another, even if it's only one step, never mind, a whole bunch of focus on many different topics. There's a lot of things we talk about here at the Science Center, many different topics of science. We have galleries of each individual topic, but we focus heavily on trying to keep an exhibit, it's something we call scope creep. We have to watch out for that very carefully, where an object has too many aspirations and therefore it winds up having no impact. It reminds me sort of the one colleague or friend we all have that emails you with every email being important, right? We all know that person, and if you don't know that person, it might be you. But in net effect is that you start ignoring those emails because it can all be important. Everything can't be the most important thing in the world. And so when we do an exhibit design here, the individual exhibits, you have to make sure, okay, well, what is the message of this exhibit, right? How does it align, as Gretchen said, with our sort of identity? How does it align with our objective? What is the takeaway message for this object? And it's focusing on that that I think can start to be lost as we move to digital transitional media. People start to focus on technology too much and not about the message. And so I think the challenge will be to stay focused on the storytelling, on the message of the object, as opposed to focusing on the technology and kind of amazing somebody with with spectacular graphics, spectacular video. Those things are amazing. They are. I'm not saying they're not. I'm just saying we have to focus on storytelling and focus on the objective we have. What is our takeaway? So I think that what would be the skills we need moving forward? That's a little bit of a harder question. I guess my broader answer would be to focus on helping cultivate people's ability to tell stories. I design exhibits, and so you might be thinking, well, for me, it's easy to just make an object, a table with a thing on it. You push a button, something happens, great. But I think an exhibit's role is really just to be a tool for a person, a facilitator. And we call them interpreters in our facility, our floor staff who engage with public when they're here, or even online now, and help them, help them understand topics or help them have a conversation about topics. And so for me, I think the key thing will be to foster that in people, to foster their ability to communicate, to tell stories, to synthesize information, and using the tools around them, which may be digital, as we see transitioning now, but may also be tactile, as I often design. So for me, that'll be the most important skill set to develop.
Great. Thank you so much, Milan. Our next question is for Anne-Marie Petrov, President and CEO of the Winspear Center and the Edmonton Symphony Orchestra. Anne-Marie, I know this is a question that's on everyone's mind. How do we fund experiences we can't necessarily monetize?
Well,
The million-dollar question.
And then some. So if you think about the term monetization, and it's an interesting word, I would say it's part of a vernacular in this day and age. Really came about, I think it was about around the 1980s. It has its genesis in the banking industry. So monetizing is when you convert a non-asset generating source asset, a non-revenue generating asset into something that does generate, that does become a revenue generating source. And so there isn't a simple answer to this question. And I know that you're asking me whether, what opportunities there are to generate revenue from what would apparently be, assets that are not easily monetized. So I think the answer to this one is multifaceted. First and foremost, it's really important that you have a very diversified portfolio of of money sources coming in. And with any digital experience, obviously the most obvious source for money, it would be advertising, selling your customer data. You can gate your content. You can sell expertise, which is always a really interesting one. You can sell memberships. You could ask for donations, and I think this is where we're starting to get into the ways of making money that are not necessarily monetizing your digital content, but you are soliciting support from the community. And we've touched on it already today on today's call, but partnerships are a possibility with those organizations, companies that are aligned with you, that support and believe in your mission and what you're striving to do in the community. Companies that, if you want to, entities, let us say, that align with you. I guess in Canada, we're fortunate, and this is true in other countries as well, where the government is also a partner with many arts organizations, and they're partners with us in our digital content. And I think then the most I think reliable and long-term objective, I think, for any arts organization is to develop an endowment. I mean, these are all things that we know. I don't think I'm sharing anything with you that is, a real zeitgeist. But what I want to touch on quickly in this challenge that we have around the term monetization is monetization suggests there's a commercial component to what we do. And I think this is the rub for us in arts organizations, and as we move into the digital forum more and more, let us say, is that commercial suggests that it has a commercial appeal, and the conflict is that is not necessarily what arts are intended to do. Arts can be commercialized, but they shouldn't have to be or they shouldn't by necessity be commercialized. And this is the interesting debate and topic. Creativity in and of itself requires constraints. We know that, whether it's constraints in terms of the medium, constraints in terms of the tools that are available to you, constraints in terms of time, constraints in terms of size. But the important thing about the digital side of things is that commercializing and monetization can also suggest censorship. And this is where I think it's important to have partners, call it funders, foundations, and an endowment, so that art is not censored because it needs to be commercial. And I'm going to leave my statement at that, because I know that there's going to be other opportunities for this topic to continue to be discussed.
That's great. Thanks, Anne-Marie. And actually, it's no coincidence that the next question is going over to you, Tateo. And I neglected to introduce you at the start, Tateo. Tateo is an ARIP fellow, and ARIP is the organization that has been working with the WinSpear on the building of our completion project. And just while I'm passing the question over to Tateo, a reminder to our audience that please start putting your questions into the chat, anything that's occurring to you as you're listening. We are taking note of all the questions that are coming in, and we will be trying to get them all lots of airtime to get discussed in our upcoming Q&A. So Tateo, how do we fund experiences we can't necessarily monetize?
I think I'm going to pick up on what Anne-Marie, I think, was saying and relate it back to the challenge I was trying to talk about earlier. I think the history of this area to date suggests that monetization as a goal is challenging. And when we think about that, I think the need to consider it an additional cost in of itself is a reflection of this speed at which we evolve, isn't it? Because the reality is, I don't know that much of it is an option moving forward. Right? It's in a spectrum of how we communicate, how we organize ourselves, and how we wish to connect with our audiences. Fine, but if we're in a part of our sector that is about monetization, you are selling an entertainment product, fair enough, then it's within that. But if we're also in a part of the sector where we're talking about community building, identity, who we are, wellness, the benefits that we have in our society for having access to music or to the visual arts, then it's part of how we respond and how we deliver that. And then the monetization opportunity is not so much the point, but rather how do we pay for what we know is important to do, and how does society pay for it? And there might be a dislocation between in the way the ecosystem financially has set itself up, because now there are more costs with different values distributed that have to be paid for. I think it is an interesting area where many people, everybody really is thinking about it. I think that many things have been tried. Some of the areas that I think are most interesting is where the organizations and artists have been able to put the same value, whether it is through a mixture, a hybrid, or a digital product or not. Some examples that have been remarkable to me, as they are, include, for example, there's an orchestra in Japan that is actually selling tickets at the same price to live and to an augmented reality version of the performance, same concert, and actually live streamed, so you can only enjoy it at that time. But apparently there are many people in the audience who bought tickets twice, right? They go to the live concert and then they go the next night to a version of it that has an overlay of augmented reality, of visual art, an immersive experience that goes on to it. And that's interesting, I thought, because actually instead of saying this is the real experience and that's the real experience, actually there are two different experiences, but work with the same group of artists in a way. Similarly, I thought it was very interesting to have a relatively early experience during the pandemic where a theatre in London actually only sold access to a very limited number of people online for the same cost of ticket. So instead of actually making available with the goal of access to a lot more people through a virtual medium, they actually made it a experience that was designed for that, and then charged a normal ticket price. And actually they sold out. And so the understanding your medium and actually what you're trying to do, not making it something that is a document or a paler version, is probably the start to that question of, at the end of the day, we are talking to different audiences, making use of things that we have invented, creatively integrating that into our outputs. It will change the way we as a society pay for it, because it has value, and it will require change to our ecosystem. And so the monetization in the short term will continue to be a challenge, I suspect, which is probably not a very positive thing to say, but I'm afraid will continue to be a challenge.
That's a great answer, Teo, and I think it speaks to how the different ways we value different experiences. So I know there's going to be more talk about that too. So thank you, Teo. And I'm going to move on to Scott again. And Scott, your question here is, what institutional infrastructure should we be considering as we move forward?
Yeah, that's such a hard question. So I'm reading that question in a couple of different ways. I'm thinking about physical infrastructure, presentation spaces and things, but I'm also thinking about administrative programming kinds of things. So maybe I'll start with I want to double back to what Anne Marie was saying about commercialization and the commercial appeal that suggests that there should be some commercial appeal, and this is on, like, I think what's important to understand about monetization is that ultimately, as a presenting organization, we just want, or if we're a presenting organization, we just want to be able to encourage and enable artists to continue making work, right? And so sometimes I think these kinds of issues are best handled by the professional organizations who sometimes set rates for things, and so that can be helpful. But in addressing this question, I guess, one thing I think about here is I'm going to talk a little just for a second about physical infrastructure, because and also skill sets in terms of what's possible in various physical infrastructures. So at the university, I coordinate the composition program. And one thing that I've really learned over the last, 2 or 3 decades now, I guess, is that the modes of presenting and creating work have expanded so much that the traditional performance spaces that we rely on are not necessarily adequate. And so there's a tension, I think, between having a presentation space that's extremely flexible versus the sort of turnkey need for a space to be able to, like, turn on and be ready to go. And so I think what my dream facility, I guess, for a presentation, like a music organization, well, first of all, I think it's important that all of the presenting organizations maintain good relationships with other presenting organizations who are presenting in other media, and looking for opportunities to collaborate and to understand that the world of music just by itself is, there are a lot of artists who are interested in working in other media. We're starting to see artists emerge who are experts in multiple medias, right? So it's always a good idea, I think, for presenting organizations to look for opportunities to do multidisciplinary work. And then, the WindSphere, one thing that the WindSphere has going for it is you have a wonderful acoustic space. Acoustics are so important. I mean, right now, it's easy to forget, in the COVID moment, we're all sort of confined to screens and online viewing of things. When that ends, and it will end, people are going to be flocking back to these to performance spaces for live events. And they're going to be demanding some pretty, intense experiences that both in terms of traditional performance, but also other kinds of experiences. I love the VR, AR landscape that's emerging. I don't know if you've heard of the Museum of Other Realities. It's a new virtual gallery. But yeah, I mean, I just think thinking about infrastructure is important. And one thing that I would love to see, I've talked a little bit about this with the WindSphere folks, but is if there were opportunities to create new spaces within that facility, exhibition spaces. I think sound art is a mode of presenting sound and music that is still pretty new. I mean, it's been around for a long time, but that it's gaining a lot of traction, and it's unfortunate that most of the white wall galleries are not really, they're not great places for presenting sound work, right? So that's an area that I think that music presenting organizations can delve into a little bit, imagining that we could create a really, really good sound art facility that, you know, imagine the Windsphere had a couple of galleries in it that could be visited during the day, commissioning work. So thinking about having programming not only for performing arts in these facilities, but also exhibiting sound art pieces. That's just an example. I'm also really enthusiastic about the possibility of games and interactive modes of presentation. And I can talk more about that later, but yeah, it's a tough question. And I think what it all boils down to is being willing to collaborate with other media and being willing to rethink the kinds of presentation spaces that we can have. Black boxes are really good for being able to customize, for example, and I can talk more about that. I'm going to talk about that in my talk next week quite a bit. So.
Yes, and Scott, when you mentioned sound art in the Windsphere, we're working on that. That is definitely a priority. And you can see that our CEO has chimed in chat and said, yes, sound art is a must for us. So, so thank you, Scott. And I'm going to pass this question on to Milan. So Milan, what are your thoughts on what institutional infrastructure should be we should be considering as we move forward?
Yes, thank you. That's another great question. You know, if the Windsphere is looking for someone to help with gallery development, I know a guy that can help you out with that.
We are so blessed in Edmonton with.
We are, it's true.
So Milan, and you're in there.
It's true. We have some great colleagues here in town. So I think this answer depends quite a bit on the organization in question. You know, what infrastructure you need depends on what you're presenting. And I think, as Scott touched on, flexibility is a huge aspect that we're focusing on here at our facility. In the last few galleries that I've helped design or had some part designing, we've emphasized having a small space within the gallery that acts as sort of an in-gallery facilitation space, programming space, classroom space, whatever you want to call that. That's meant to be highly flexible for demonstrations, for classrooms to gather marching orders for the day, for visitors on weekends when there are no classrooms, or during summertime when we have just tourists. And we'll have, again, as Scott mentioned, you know, to come and see demonstrations that we can't do with an exhibit. We focus on this flexibility in at least part of our gallery. And one of our galleries now is called the Science Garage, which we developed over the past few years in a couple of iterations. And it is a whole room, actually now 2 rooms, about 4,000 square feet each, that are dedicated to exhibits that are not a traditional exhibit. By which I mean, in the past, my role has been to basically determine the outcome of an exhibit, right? I, as a designer, and my colleagues as programmers and scientists would determine what the outcome was of an exhibit experience. And when the user came, they would push a button or move a lever and something would happen. And they'd say, oh, okay, well, I either get the outcome or I don't get the outcome. But what we're moving to now is a field which we call a user-driven outcome. And so that means that I provide to, my colleagues and I, as the facility and I, provide to our guests a question, a problem, something for them to think about. And then we, instead of giving them a button to push and a lever to move, try to have experiences where they have tools to solve this question. So we may say things like, you know, can you get this object from point A to point B? And here are some tools to try that. You know, can you try some tools from other exhibits to see if you can make that work better? And so what we're finding is a sort of almost a democratization, I should say, of problem solving. It's moving away from just push a button, something happens, to, okay, here's some tools, here's a question, what do you think? And in that way, also at times we can make it more economical to have these exhibits. And, you know, doing an exhibit that has a specific outcome, there's still a place for that. You know, we have shows like Harry Potter when they come and, okay, you do one thing and you're amazed by it, of course, right? But other times there are exhibits where, and that's very expensive, as you can probably imagine, to develop exhibits of that size. If any of you came to that show when it was here in 2013, I think it was, the thing was massive. You know, it filled our entire 10,000 square foot traveling hall. Most of our traveling shows are 8, 9 semi-trucks. This thing was 24 semi-trucks. It was unbelievable. A crew of 34 people came. Anyway, it was humongous. It was amazing to be part of that. But the point is, that was incredibly expensive to develop. And it has one outcome, right? You come and see the things that are based on brands and properties that you're familiar with and that you love, you grew up with, and you experience them in that way and you leave. And that's your takeaway. Whereas for us, we're moving to a model wherein we try to get a different level of impact, a less autonomous exhibit, one that requires users to participate and to be part of the solution. And we often find people, our guests come with solutions that we didn't even think of, which is a wonderful thing to have happen. And so for me, it seems almost like I'm out of a job soon because, I'm not designing exhibits anymore. But I think that that's not the case. I feel like, as I think someone said earlier, our primary role is to communicate. And I think that will always be important. And so to come back around to the answer to this question, I think as we develop our facility and look for future infrastructure, we're going to look at, the sort of natural answer, which is, as Scott commented on, speed and connectivity and power and so on. But I think also we're going to look to enhance the access to things, whether that's access based on limitations that come geographically, socioeconomically, or whether they come through sense limitations or mobility issues. We're looking to improve access to the experiences with the infrastructure. And that means different things for different topics and different things for different facilities. So I don't want to be broad with my answer, but I think I would focus it down to saying, that's what I'm really concerned with now, is providing more access to people to our experiences and putting things in place to help that.
Beautiful. Thanks so much, Milan.
Sure.
And I'm going to move on with a question for Rafael. Rafael, what have we learned from the COVID-19 pandemic that has provided us with something we will use in the future?
Different things. First off, I think it is important to keep in mind that there are different things. First off, it is important to do and try out things before we actually need them. Now, incorporating technology into professional workflows shouldn't have been an emergency solution to maneuver a global pandemic. It should have been something, and should be something after the pandemic that we continue to leverage for the benefit of our companies. Now, technology improves performance. Video production capabilities. 80% of the traffic online is because of people watching video, and it was the case even before the pandemic. So publishing and broadcasting audiovisual content will not go anywhere. However, it would be nice to explore what else we could do with video. Now, it's not only a matter of how we broadcast the concert, but how we can leverage video to diversify our offering and expand the reach of our brands. No, that coming together works. No, that when we want to advance science at a faster speed, we can. No, that when we want to develop a technological infrastructure and tools, we do it. So we don't need the external pressure of a challenge like the one we went through to explore solutions and work together and raise the bar, of what we're doing. As I said before, remote collaboration, I think, is here to stay, and it's for the benefit of the companies and the employees. No, happy people will always perform better, and deliver better results. I also think that teams benefit from hiring the right people. So being very diligent of who you are bringing on board, people that are transparent and organized and reliable and capable and committed and nimble. Challenging situations like this one require versatile individuals. I also think that we don't need as many meetings as maybe we used to have pre-pandemic. Now, if you assemble the right team, present a clear idea, and you have an adequate number of touch points, you can just let them work and things will be fine. Now, people can use that time of those unnecessary meetings to actually, deliver the results. And that wellness matters. Now, taking care of yourself is a top priority. Now, the lockdown has put us to the test. Now, if you don't exercise, you gain weight. If you don't have the right chair to work at home, you develop back pain. Now, not having a plan for the day and just working all day, it can easily burn you out. So wellness matters, and it has to be a top priority for the individual and for the institutions. No, and Annette mentioned this briefly before. No, that art matters, that the arts matter. And and they have proven to be an invaluable companion during these challenging times. No, many people have come to realize not only how much they liked it, but some of them maybe that they actually like it more than what they used to acknowledge. No, so let's make sure to that we continue to bring value to people's lives and make a difference and offer comfort and spark a conversation and overall spread joy, no?
Thank you for that, Rafael. And Ottilie is, I'm noticing in the chat, she's just agreeing with how amazing it would be if we were at the point of testing stuff before we had to be reactive. And part of me is wondering, well, that's a little bit of human nature, but we have learned something from COVID in that regard for absolutely sure. Let us all remember it. Thank you, Rafael. I'm going to pose the same question to Gretchen now. So Gretchen, what have we learned from COVID-19 pandemic that has provided us with something we will use in the future?
Sure. And Rafael, I would like to actually start by piggybacking on what you had just said. And I think one of the things that we will always take with us from this is that music and the arts are a universal language, right? No matter what culture we are, no matter what country we're in, no matter what subject it is a universal language, and it can cross barriers, which I think is an invaluable lesson. Sort of tangential to that, Annette mentioned the idea of building bridges. I think that for us, the idea that COVID, the virtual performances and the presentations have really taught us that we're able to reach a much broader audience. And I don't want us to lose sight of that as we all migrate back, right? And, you know, Scott, you're right. Everybody is going to be so hungry to get back into those physical spaces, but let's not forget that we are always striving to reach these broader audiences and these more diverse audiences. So go to them. Don't always expect them to come to you. And it can be successful if we do it in a meaningful, intentional way. You know, Milan mentioned the person who emails all the time and everything is urgent. And I hope I'm not that person, but we all know one or many. And that sort of speaks to one of the things that I was thinking about, and that is that creating great content is more important than just getting your name out there, right? I don't care what happens in the next decade. The whole idea of creating relevant, meaningful, targeted content will never change. So less is more, and building a strategy is critical. I would say the last couple of thoughts that I had on this, because it's such a big issue, is that digital and virtual platforms can be used sort of in essence to leave breadcrumbs and build momentum for live performances and to stay connected before, during, and after those experiences. I think that Tateo mentioned that one performance that had both the augmented reality and the live performance. And I do think that thinking about these digital tools in a way that does create a different kind of experience in a positive way is really key to their power. And then I would say, you know, a couple of other things, looking at the fact that all these strengths, all these tools have strengths and weaknesses. And by that, I mean, first and foremost, that we're not looking to replace the in-person performances and experiences. However, it's opened that wonderful door to reach those new audiences and to keep them interested and to draw them in, and to, especially with the idea of the inaccessibility of the arts and music in some cases, they have an access point that feels a little bit less intimidating. So again, using that to our advantage, I think is really, really important. I want us to remember about outdoor spaces. We talk so much about interior spaces and places. Let's break out of the walls. Let's talk about what can be done in parking lots, in grassy areas, projected on the outsides of buildings, looking from the inside out and the outside in, so that being vocal can happen in so many different ways, that we have to sort of expand our thinking on that. So, I think, much like, we just opened the US Olympic and Paralympic Museum this past year. And one of the things we were talking about is that when ADA and universal design came out years ago, they were sort of bad things to think about. It was like, oh, we have to do this, what do we have to do to layer on top? Let's think about COVID and ADA and universal design in a different way. how important is it to be more accessible and to think about it as the first thing as opposed to the last thing that you have to do? It's that you should want to do those things for your audience. That's it.
Great, thank you, Gretchen. So our final question, we're going to first go to Anne-Marie, and this is a question that was actually brought up by an audience member during an earlier presentation, and we wanted to bring it back in its exact form for consideration here. Anne-Marie, can you discuss the responsibilities that arts organizations have in lifting voices and hosting important societal conversations?
So the word that I find so interesting in this particular question, because it's a nuance, is what's the responsibility of arts organizations, which is different than asking what the responsibility of the arts are, which is interesting to me. I mean, arts organizations by their nature, and it depends if you're talking about an arts organization, and we quickly might, defer to the word institution, in fact. Because the danger for us as institutions, organizations, is depending on our size, that perhaps we by our nature need to remember and remind ourselves that it is really fundamentally about the art. And this is you've asked this question about other people in terms of what's the impact of COVID. I think that for arts organizations, the silver lining of this very, very challenging time is that we've had to really understand just how nimble are we and how much are we really able to service the art. Because at the end of the day, art is about being responsive. In the question you heard, let me just reframe it for myself, but the question here is, what's our responsibility and how do we uplift voices? As organizations, we need to make sure that we're really focused on serving the art, because the art gives hope, and it gives hope to people because it provides expression. And you heard me use the word censorship earlier. In the digital world, censorship has a whole other meaning. So it's a loaded word. But I think the important thing about arts organizations is that that we're focused on hope, that we give expression, that we lead, that we give courage. And the thing about an organization, again, depending on the size, is that we can do it on a scale that can have enormous impact. And I think that really needs to be the primary focus. And I just want to relay a small story. In my years of working at the Winnipeg Symphony, it was in the early days of the New Music Festival. And Bramwell Tovey was our artistic director at the time. And he said something that has stuck with me for the rest of my career and has been a guiding light. He said, had we done a survey, had we asked the community whether a new music festival at the time, and this would have been in the 90s, is something that they wanted, no, probably the answer would have been no. They wouldn't have. But it was because of a partner that made that festival come off the ground in its infancy, that helped underwrite the cost of it. It was as a result of that Winnipeg Symphony, in fact, took a leadership role in new music. And hence, these were early days of the conversation around diversity and inclusion. But that's what that new music festival is at the Winnipeg Symphony. And so I think that's a good example of one of the responsibilities that we have as arts organizations. And it's one of the things that we can do because of our scale. And we need to really remember that we're ultimately always in service of the art.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. And I know, Annette, you are going to be answering the same question, and I'll just repeat it. What are the responsibilities that arts organizations have in lifting voices and hosting important societal conversations?
I mean, that's a tough act to follow. I feel like Anne-Marie has sort of set out an amazing job. I love hearing, the words courage and expression there. I think, we work in the arts. I think none of us came here because we thought that this would lead to wealth and riches. I think most people work in the arts is because they believe in the role that culture has to play in providing a space for reflection and transcendence, a way to lift us out of the day-to-day, but also simultaneously to offer a space that reflects our society, both its diversity and what it can become. And I think within everything, within digital as well as on our stages, that remains our responsibility, and that doesn't go away. I think the reason I'm attracted to this sphere at the moment, that sort of crossover between digital technology and culture, is because it's, in many ways, it's been around, but it's also still in its infancy. There are still structures to be made. And we can invent how we want to do this. There are new kinds of processes, new ways of meeting our audiences, new ways of opening up our canon, and new ways of creating new pieces of work that I think allows us to do some of those things that come out of that greater good, to really think about who we platform, how we work together, these new kinds of creative teams. Can we just jump over some of the problems we have with diversity and inclusion and just sort of go for it, because actually we're inventing it anyway, so we can take that with us. And so for me, that part of it is super inspiring. Let's really be conscious and conscientious about whose voices get which platforms and how. And I think, again, this sphere gives us a lot of space. I think for me, there's a secondary thing that's going on at the moment, because of, obviously, I sometimes talk about digital, which is such a big sphere anyway, as almost like a new public space, right? We all use it, we all visit it, we all get some of our information there, we connect to loved ones on there, we talk to friends and enemies. It's a new storytelling space. In many ways, it's a new public space. And culture, we're not the only ones occupying that space and trying to figure out what we do with it. Politics is there, commercialism is there, brands are there. So for me, there's a really interesting space for us to talk together about how we as the art, what we see as the arts and art organizations, but also artists, what is our role in there? How do we make sure that it's open and inclusive? Because Amazon isn't going to do that. So what role can we play in that? How do we make sure it's a place for imagination and not just for transaction? How do we do those things that art has done so well in public spaces throughout the ages? How do we think about it as another, village green in which a festival happens and where we bring people together? What is our role in that space? So I think for me, there is what can I do as an organization? What can I do as an artist? How do we become more inclusive? But also we as culture, how do we plant our flag in this, Terra Nova, and make sure that equitable society that is based on curiosity and inclusion and new ideas and imagination, how is that present within that landscape? I think is a really important question. And I think I'm really excited. That's why I come to these things. That's why it's to meet people who are on that journey and together sort of make a dash for it. I think that's what's exciting right now.
Thank you, Annette. And I love that reminder that this is all in its infancy, and that there are, when you think about the frontiers that are ahead of us, who knows, and they're exciting. Thanks for that inspiring answer. Now we're going to open the floor for questions. So please either pop your questions in the chat or raise your hand to ask a question. I'd like to introduce my colleague, Anne-Marie Switzer, coordinator in musical creativity at the WinSphere. And Anne-Marie is going to help me moderate with this question period. So Anne-Marie, do we have any questions so far? I think I've seen a few coming in on the chat.
Yeah, I'm going to throw to Madeline's question from the chat. As transitioning to digital can be a significant change in an organization's operation, what kinds of approaches are useful for supporting staff through that transition? And I think Rafael has spoke a little bit to this, so maybe he wants to expand. Oh, you're just muted, Rafael.
Thank you. Thank you for that again. Anne-Marie, please rephrase the question for me.
Sure. So when we're transitioning to digital, that can obviously be a very significant change for organizations. And so what kinds of approaches might be useful to support the staff who have to make that transition?
For sure. I think that first off, having having a designated budget for technology, I think it would be important. Something that you can rely every year on that. If there is a new piece of software, good, you have a budget. If there is a need to replace the camera because maybe there's a new generation that it's better, good, you have a budget for that. The good thing is that technology is becoming cheaper, so you don't need to break the bank to acquire high quality gear. In addition to that, I think it's important that the institutions invest in the education of their employees from the top to the bottom, from the bottom to the top, not only certain teams, because it is with that common foundation and that common understanding that then you can pitch an idea and they could say, yeah, of course, it is important to purchase such and such because yes, that's going to help us to have better community engagement projects, or to offer for free certain things that will maybe create awareness of the brand, and then we'll bring more people to the concert hall. So yeah, having a budget for a budget that you can count on, I think that's important. But also making the effort of having everyone on the same page, so that you can speak the same language and all of them see the importance of those projects. Now, if they're not in the same page, sometimes could be tricky to say, hey, this is important in the course of the next 2 years. This is going to bring this and this value to the institution. And maybe I just think knowledge helps to put things into the right perspective. No?
Yeah, shared vision and understanding. So thank you, Rafael. I have a question now for Gretchen, and it's about obstacles. So Gretchen, what obstacles to our digital transition are still in place, and why are they still obstacles? Would you like to speak to that?
Sure. As that question popped up, I just had a couple of thoughts, and I think one of them is that quite often the idea of these media moments and these digital interventions and these fusions of the physical and digital space are considered as just the media designer's job, right? So instead of looking at it, as was mentioned earlier, as a problem-solving exercise, as an overarching strategy, and in the experiential realm of things, it's sort of like, where do we have a wall that's available? What spaces don't we want to interrupt the architecture? Where is it that we can sort of wedge these in, as opposed to really conceiving these as a multidisciplinary type of exercise? And I think that it is incumbent on us as the people who do this to educate our clients as to, how important that is. And I would say, secondarily, the other thing that I was thinking about is that I do believe that there is this preconceived notion that, and Rafael just mentioned this, that it's so expensive that we can't even consider it, right? And that, the budgets are set, and here's the architecture budget, and, here's the, acoustician's budget, and here's the experience designer's budget, and, let's just all go into our little sandbox and do our thing and then come back together. So I think that what we have to consider is that these don't have to be astronomically expensive, although the ones that are should be considered for what they bring to your project. So, I just think that whole idea of this multidisciplinary problem-solving strategy that looks at how it affects the overall visitor experience is all too often not the case with that.
Thanks, Gretchen. That's an amazing perspective, and thank you for sharing that with us on that question. I'm going to throw to Eric's latest question in the chat. How do arts organizations avoid the temptation of going back to how we used to do it after this pandemic is over, instead of continuing to forge new ways with those initiatives. And I'm thinking to Teo, you've spoken to this a little bit already. Perhaps you'd like to expand to answer Eric's question.
Look, I think it's a very, very good question. And I think it's one that all organizations at whatever scale is dealing with. We've seen major organizations decide not to go back to the office or to look at different ways of working. We've seen, in a way, an amazing jump that arts organizations around the world have taken a leap forward in what they're doing as a way of, somebody said earlier, I think, almost a desperation of staying alive and staying relevant. And I think this ties back to one of the earlier questions about what should we be doing as organizations. I think it's really important to take a moment to really think about how society has changed and what we should be doing as organizations and as artists. And actually considering what might be better. Is it nicer that you can actually have lunch at home with your partner actually at work? Is it actually quieter, or actually because of babies and other things, it's actually noisier and you can't concentrate? There are things that are better, there are things that are worse. There are things that are easier, there are things that are harder. There are new audiences you can connect to, but old audiences you might lose. All of this requires some strategic thought. And I think as organizations, we at RF also have been going through a digital transformation, and in that sense, looking at how we can become more of a data-driven organization as well. And probably the most important thing is to take the time and think about it, and to take the time to really think about what you should be doing, what the goal is. And if that then clarifies it, I think the recognition that some things are better, some things are different. How do we actually get there would put you on a road rather than just rebound to what it was.
That's great, Teo, and that is actually going to be wrapping up our session today. It's been I said at the beginning, we were hoping for a rich conversation, and I would say that we got exactly what we had intended. Such a great panel of guests, and a sincere thank you to each of you for being with us. I kept hearing words like flexibility, adaptation, and storytelling, knowing your audience, expanding your audience, and not ever forgetting the opportunity that this brings us to be reaching a much broader audience. And yeah, a little bit of inspiration too about the way that we are all at the beginning of another whole huge change, and it offers tremendous opportunities for all of us. So I hope you'll join us next Wednesday, same time, same place, same channel. It's going to be Artists and Technology Working Together. And as a reminder, the registration is free, but we hope that you'll consider a donation, and a link to the registration page and our donation page have been placed in the chat for you to easily access. Also, by the end of the week, you will receive an email with notes from this event. So I hope that we can do the conversation justice in what we provide in the notes, but certainly would love to have any of your feedback and responses, and we can carry on this conversation in other ways as well. There will be, I think, a survey that you'll be receiving, and we look forward to your feedback. So all of you stay safe, and we look forward to welcoming you again next week, and thank you for being with us today.